Hello, my name is Francesca Lamargia, and I'm the founder and director of Mother Tongues. I'm going to be sharing my experience, my knowledge, and a lot of stories and tips and good practice concerning the topic of nurturing and culturally and linguistically responsive environment. This is a topic that is very close to my heart because we know that more and more children are growing up in Ireland speaking more than one language, being immersed in multiple languages and multiple cultures. So it's extremely important to create an environment, no matter where the child is, where all languages are welcome, where all cultures and all views of the world are nurtured, and where all children feel that they belong and they can share their identity, whether linguistic or cultural identity. So we're going to have a series made up of three videos, and each one of them will touch on a different topic. So the first one is going to focus on how children develop two or more languages. The second one will focus on how practitioners can support the development of two or more languages and nurture different cultures. And finally, in the third part of the video, you can see how in your own setting, you can create an environment that welcomes all languages and cultures. The webinars are interconnected. The topics will be obviously related to one another. And I suppose we'll look at both examples of good practice, but also experiences. And we'll have some opportunities also to look at how we ourselves, as people working with children, perceive different languages and cultures in our environment, in our work, in our society. And it's very important to take into account where we're coming from in terms of our practice and our own identity when we're dealing with children with a range of different cultural and linguistic identities. So the three videos will have the possibility for you to watch in your own time, but also to comment. And there'll be more information under this video on how you can engage by asking questions and commenting. The topics we will discuss are relevant both to English and to Irish medium settings. And also it's very important to acknowledge that migration is not a new phenomenon in Ireland. Many practitioners, many of you will have been engaging with bilingual children, multilingual children and families for many years. But also we know that since 2022, there has been an increase in number of migrant refugee children. And this has created a more pressing need for all practitioners to be educated in these matters. And there's been a great desire from people to learn about new approaches and to how to improve certain aspects of the practice. Just to get started, before we get into more details about language development, I wanted to just have a few different terms that we tend to use when we talk about language development in children who speak multiple languages. So what you see on the left is the terms bilingual, multilingual, plurilingual. And very often when I'm with a group of people and I say, well, raise your hand if you are bilingual, no one raises their hand because there's this idea that you have to be equally fluent in two languages or extremely fluent in two languages to be considered bilingual. So the terminology can be, confusing sometimes, but in general, just for the sake of our conversation today and like the information sharing that you may be doing after, the term bilingual does not mean that you're equally fluent in two languages. It doesn't mean that you're native in two languages. So I am bilingual, but I'm not a native speaker of English. Irish speakers who grow up in the Gaeltacht are likely to be bilingual. Someone who is a native speaker of two languages, like someone in the Gaeltacht, but has more proficiency in one than the other, is still bilingual. If you can only read 3 words on a menu and the words are pizza and pasta, and that's all that you can do, then you're not bilingual. So we use the term bilingual to refer to people who can interact and exchange age-appropriate information, conversation, communication in two languages. When there's three or more, we talk about multilingual, plurilingual, depending on what we're talking about. We have then what I think is really important. We have simultaneous bilinguals, and these are the children who are growing up from pretty much from birth or from a very young age speaking two languages. And a simultaneous bilingual, again, could be considered or is often considered as a native speaker of both languages. But we find that very often one language is stronger than the other or more dominant than the other. And then we have the word EAL, which many of you are familiar with, which is English as an additional language. But I also wanted to introduce the word successive bilingual, or second language learner, which is someone who is learning or becoming bilingual by learning one language after another. So, for example, you develop English as a first language and you learn Irish as a second language. So you are a successive bilingual, or in education settings, some people tend to call it EAL. Successive bilingual applies to all languages because not every second language learner is learning English as an additional language. And many children in your settings might have three or more languages, so that's something to bear in mind. I think it's also very important that we focus on this idea of the dominance of one language over the other. It's quite likely that children might be stronger in one language for a specific reason. Maybe at a very, very early stage, they might be more dominant in the language of the family, which is what they've heard the most. It might be common for children who enter primary school to start to really build friendships and relationships, and suddenly their dominant language becomes English, or the language of schooling. So this idea of a dominant language is really something that fluctuates in time as children develop, as children socialize. So it's not fixed, it's not something that stays with the child forever. So let's have a look at some key points in children's language development. I'm going to start from a very early stage, and think about some of the features that are, or some of the characteristics that are typical of children who develop more than one language. Many of these will be really common to all children, so they'll be probably not new to many of you. So when children start to interact, they're using a lot of visual cues to understand the adults' intentions. They're looking at adults and other people's smiles and gesture and behaviors in general to understand. So that language is accompanied by a lot of other visual cues, like embracing and looking and sharing, sharing an object and both paying attention and sharing attention on the object, and so on and so forth. So a lot of language is acquired this way, by watching, by interacting, by listening, and by being fully engaged in a conversation. So when children are growing up using two languages on a regular basis, or when they're hearing another language, they're using all the information around them. They're processing all this information around them to make sense of the meaning of words. So if you think about how monolingual children learn a word such as, I don't know, flower for the first time, they hear it, they see it in context. They may see someone picking up a flower and saying the sentence, I'm picking up a flower, or, oh, what a beautiful smell this flower has. So they'll hear the word flower in many, many different contexts. And suddenly, after a number of occurrences, they will make the association that that is a flower. It looks different from the other flower, but maybe all these things called flower have something in common. And that's how they learn the meaning of the word flower and dog and everything else. So if we think about bilingual children, it's no different, other than they're learning that that object can be associated with more than one label. So it's dog, but it's also perro if you're speaking Spanish. And how do children get to this? They get to this by being exposed to it. So often one of the things that parents ask is whether they should be teaching their children their language, whether they should be taking out flashcards and saying, okay, in English, this is dog. And how do you say it in Spanish? And say perro, and then say dog, perro. But actually, how do children acquire language? They don't acquire language with flashcards. Children acquire language by pure exposure. So I think this is my first important point, that children do learn additional languages. They do learn two languages simultaneously by being immersed in these languages. So whether this is in an early childhood setting, whether it's in the home setting, conversation, communication, eye contact, and plenty of examples of, good examples, plenty of modeling of language is how children learn the meaning of words, and it's how children start to put their sentences together. There is a point when children get a little bit older. Maybe this is a picture of a 1-year-old. So at this point, children start to probably say words here and there, and say words like mommy and daddy, and maybe referring to their favorite pet. And at 1 year of age, we hear very often, oh, a child should be saying X number of words. And a lot of bilingual families are quite concerned when children reach 12 to 18 months of age, because they're immediately more concerned, the families of monolingual children. So it's really key at this stage to focus on what the child is doing, how much the child is understanding in terms of being able to respond to commands or answering questions, even with a smile or with a gesture. So really checking for children's understanding, but also encouraging parents to talk more to their children and not to worry about which languages they're talking in, to talk to the children and to, look at them in the eyes, interact, play. So play develops language, interaction develops language. So there's no need for additional tools or for language teaching as such. Language is acquired when we interact with one another, and babies are the best at this. But as children reach about 18 months to 2 years, again, in some cases, they start to put sentences together. And from the point of view of bilingual children, which is the only thing that I would say is pretty different from monolingual children, is that if you have more than one language, in one sentence that you put together, you can put words from more than one language. So you will often hear sentences that start in Polish and finish in English, sentences that start in Irish and end in English, or the other way around. So this idea of being able to use two languages, children often don't think about it. They just have words and sentence structures in more than one language. They're playing with it. So from a very young age, you might hear a child referring to milk, maybe in the language of their parents, because maybe that's where they hear the word milk the most. And then they might go home and use a sentence such as tidy up time, which they hear in the early childhood setting. And so this is completely natural. Children switching from one language to the other, even in the same sentence, using words in the setting, coming to you and saying, can I have some leche, please? And they might be referring to milk in Spanish because that's how they're thinking of the word. That's how most naturally it comes very, very natural to them. So this is the key probably difference that you can witness in this specific stage of sentence development. There are also interesting phenomena around pronunciation and sounds, because children are developing two systems of phonology. And so they're starting to pronounce words in language A and in language B. And sometimes they might use a word that is pronounced in a certain way, and it might be unfamiliar to you, but very, very quickly children are very well able to distinguish between the two languages, of course, but also they will know when it's appropriate to use a word in a certain way, or when it's appropriate to switch and when it's not appropriate to switch. It's just that at the beginning, they're playing with language, they're playing with sounds, and they might be using shorter sentences as well, because young children use sentences that only have the key words, such as nouns and verbs, and then their sentences become more complex. So they introduce prepositions and they introduce verbal inflections. So instead of saying me gone, they might say I have gone. But this takes time, and this is valid for monolingual and for bilingual children. But again, the thing is, so many bilingual parents or parents of bilingual children are extra concerned because they think what their children are doing is unnatural, or it may be different from other children. So it's really important to also share the awareness that children, when they start to put sentences together, at the very beginning, the sentences are not complete. They're missing some elements, which are the functional elements. As children get towards the age of 3, of course, they get more chatty between 3 and 4. They start to socialize and to create bonds around their own interests, which might be cars or toys or certain sport activities that they play together with their friends. They might still play on their own quite a lot. But linguistically, children are becoming much more mature, and they are continuing to switch at this age between the ages of 3 and 4, and they can use their switching as they need. So very, very often at this stage, children start to distinguish when it's appropriate to switch because everybody understands both languages, and when you're actually not understood if you use the language of your home. If children at this age are learning a second language, and I'll speak about this in a minute, it is quite a new experience for a child to learn a new language. So you can expect that they might be using their home language first when they're in the setting, and then suddenly after a while they realize that they're not understood. So this is an age where children really want to communicate and they really want to talk. And it's, as I said earlier, it's all about being immersed in all the languages. So being immersed in the family language, in the family context or with the parents, being immersed in English or in Irish in the early childhood setting, and using these languages to socialize. Children learn new words every single day at this stage. They're learning, even if they're not producing, they're learning. And something that's really important to bear in mind when it comes to any child developing language is that you first learn to understand before you can start to speak. So for some children, they will understand, say, 500 words, but they might say only 200 words. So you might not see the mismatch necessarily because you cannot see what is stored in the children's memory. But children are taking it in. So even if they're playing and they're not showing that they know all the meanings of the words, it's important to bear in mind that by listening, by absorbing all these new words, and by playing, and we'll talk about techniques in the next video, but also a little bit later on today, children are developing an understanding and of the meaning of new words. So this is also really, really important. Again, at this stage, some parents tend to be quite concerned every now and again when their children are not maybe hitting what they think should be the milestones. So again, it's important to refer families if they have a real concern that surrounds language development and that surrounds communication, comprehension. And if children are new to English, this is something that would take a very different approach, because one thing is talking about a child who's a simultaneous bilingual, as I said earlier, but one thing is talking about a child who's started to learn English 1 month or 2 months ago. And the approach would be to look at how the child is developing the language. So is the child immersed in English for 5 hours, 3 hours, no matter what the amount is, how long is the immersion in English? And how can we watch the progress over a period of 1 year? We often want 3-year-old to learn a new language in 3 weeks. And I hope everybody watching this video knows that children learn every day, but they're not suddenly going to turn fluent in a language in a very, very just a couple of weeks, because that's not how language development works. So I think what is really important is to be able to monitor progress. So not to go for the ultimate outcome that you would like, which is for this child to be the same as everyone else, but to monitor how the child is progressing in terms of use of new words, or even simply at the beginning, the understanding of what others are saying, which is the key for actual interaction. As children turn towards like 4 or 5 years of age, as they get older, they definitely are more and more interested in talking with their friends, in having conversations, in telling stories. And some of the typical features that we can see at this stage are, again, code switching, like I mentioned earlier. So this idea of going from one language to the other. Sometimes what we see in bilingual children, on children who are learning a new language, is that because they have two options for a word, it might take them a little bit of time to remember how to say that word, or if the word is on the tip of their tongue. And it's so frustrating sometimes, because children might say to you, oh yeah, I have it in my mind, but I can't remember it. And it might be a day-to-day, very simple day-to-day word. But of course, because you have a competing word in your mind, it might take you a little bit longer to remember that specific word you're looking for. Of course, things like not being able to express yourself will frustrate anyone. And children react differently to this. Some children get extremely frustrated when they cannot say what they want to say, but also when they feel that they're not understood. And I read some really interesting research around the frustration of children not being understood, not only second language learners, but also bilingual children, having their parents maybe not understanding what they're saying. And so this can be common, especially I would say in children who experience this on a regular basis, that they're trying to say something and the response is, I don't understand you. So one way to look at this is to see how can you have a dialogue where there is some shared communication around the fact that you still can understand some of the things that the child is trying to say to you, even if they're not saying them in words. So even nonverbal communication can help, facial expression and gesture can help to relieve some of this frustration. But again, it requires having dedicated time to spend with the child as well. Another common feature of bilingual children is the use of one word order of one language and then apply that to the other language. And again, it's not a mistake, it's not a concern, it's something that children do quite a lot, especially at a young age. But I suppose we see it also in primary school children. In your mind, you're using maybe the word order of the language you know best, and you apply that to the other language as well. This other point about children refusing to use the home language is something that we have seen quite a lot in our work with language explorers in mother tongues, where there might be a lot of positivity towards having children speaking the language of their parents in the classroom, and children not feeling that that's right. We've witnessed it even with children going to Gaelscoileanna and they speak Irish at home, and maybe at the very start they go, what's going on around here? Why am I using Irish when there's lots of other children? So it's not every child, but they have, there are occurrences, and there are examples of stories where children don't want to use their home language in the education setting. So it's something to bear in mind. And also, I think it's important at every age, I suppose, to have as much knowledge as possible about how the child came to learn each of the languages. Because there might be reasons why the child feels comfortable or uncomfortable around one or another language, and it's worth knowing that. And obviously, the more common it is for all children to use their home languages in the setting, the more comfortable the child will feel by, not being asked to do something strange and different in front of everybody. So we'll talk in the next video about different ways to approach this. And as I said earlier, the dominance of one language over the other might change over time, and the child might prefer one language over the other. So this can obviously change as the child grows up. And at the beginning, maybe for a child who's new to English, their preference, the language that is more comfortable and that feels more natural is their first language. But 4 or 5 years down the line, this might be completely different. And so we see this in bilingual children quite a lot. So when we talk about learning a second language, I think what I wanted to discuss today is mostly the child's perspective. So when a child is learning a second language, what do you think is going on? Imagine yourself being in a completely new place and having to speak. So what are you going to do? The child is going to be doing the exact same. And maybe children are so cued into, looking at what's around them that they'll be definitely looking at how other people are behaving. So if you maybe try for 1 second to put yourselves in the shoes of a child, and maybe imagining yourself as an adult being somewhere where you don't know what's going on. You walk into a room, you want to find out who is who, what are they doing, what are their names, what are they saying to each other. What you're going to use is your knowledge. You're going to use what you know to make sense of what you're seeing in front of your eyes. And children, of course, children are learning a second language, come with a lot of knowledge. They come with knowledge of their first language, first of all. So they do have language. They have knowledge of language. They have knowledge of what it takes to communicate, because they probably already know how to communicate. If this is a second language, it means that they have a first language. And they have this ability to learn the meaning of words, because, as we said earlier, children see patterns and then they start to learn lots of new words, and they start to understand how they need to think in order to understand the meaning of a word, in order to use a word in context. So there's a huge amount of learning that goes on in the development of your first language. And when you're learning a second language, you can reuse all of that knowledge. So you approach the learning of a second language without knowing, with a lot of knowledge. And I would like to think for today about what children already know, rather than seeing children as, you don't have English, you don't have the language you need. Switch this conversation, switch the attitude, and say, actually, you know a huge amount about how to learn, how to interact. So how can we take this knowledge, or give the child the time to take this knowledge and then adapt it and extend it to the new language? So children know that things have a name. Of course they do. So they know that they have to label things. They know that they can call for attention in a certain way, and maybe with some physical gesture. And no matter what culture you come from, there's a huge amount of shared communication patterns. And there's also a huge amount of non-shared communication patterns. So you need to watch and look at behavioral cues, and children are great at that. And many of you will have examples of children spending the first few days in a setting just looking around and seeing what is this environment that I'm in? How are people interacting with each other? What's appropriate, and so on and so forth. So a lot of visual information goes into learning a second language. And that's why very often we talk about enhancing that. So having images that are understandable and relevant, having maybe posters that indicate shapes or fruit or animals or anything that is relevant for the discussion you're having for your age group. And things that children can see, because by seeing and touching, children are learning the meaning of new words. There's also in any setting, there's a lot of formulaic language. I mentioned earlier, tidy up time. That was one example from my children who came back with this thing, tidy up time, and they started to use it in the home, even though they never heard it at home. So there's quite a lot of language that is used repetitively, and some that you know, and some that you may not notice that you're using all the time. And so this is very good because this repetition means that by reusing the same formula, you're allowing the child to take it in, and using the same sequence of words can be really, really useful. When you're learning a new language, I can give you an example in Italian. I can tell you the same thing in 3 different ways, okay? And I want to invite you for dinner, and I can say, ti va di andare a mangiare? I can say, andiamo a cena insieme. I can say, è ora di cena, ti va di andare? So all these 3 things, these 3 sentences, kind of conveys the same message. But if I want you to kind of follow me and come for dinner with me, for me, it would be better to repeat the same one in the same way at the beginning. So say, andiamo a mangiare, and then, so which means let's go and have dinner. And then the following day, I'd say, andiamo a mangiare, andiamo a mangiare. And so ultimately, you'll see me going towards the restaurant. We'll eat together. And then you'll understand that andiamo a mangiare means let's go and have dinner. But if each day I use a different one, it will take you a slightly little bit longer. Of course, language is natural. A language is not necessarily formulas, but in some contexts, it's really, really useful to maybe even write down some of the key commands and some of the key sentences that you use to, at the beginning, repeat them in the same way, especially if a child is totally new to the language. And of course, language is more complex than that, and children will learn that, but it's quite you create a safe space by repeating creating a template for the language that you use all the time. So language communication interaction is much more than single words and phrases and formulas. There's a lot of gesture being used, and gesture can be very culturally specific. Some gesture in some cultures might come across to an Irish person as being super friendly or super cold or informal or too formal. So gesture, facial expression, everything is really very much part of how we communicate. And of course, it means that it's quite culturally specific. And children are watching your facial expression, they're watching your gesture, they're watching their friends as well, their family members, and there may be different ways in which we create eye contact, ways in which we behave with younger or older people, whether we feel comfortable with physical contact or not, or whether we need a lot of physical contact, even just to say something. There's, being an Italian person, I do a lot of tapping people on the shoulder over really no reason. So again, some aspects of our communication can be very culturally specific and maybe more or less easy to interpret. But again, it's all about getting to understand who is in our group and what behaviors are they watching, what behaviors are they making sense of, and how can we understand them better by understanding their own gestures and their own behaviors. So I think it's also quite important to look at the fact that this knowledge that children come with is extremely, extremely valuable in our setting. Now, in the next video, we'll talk about really how to put it into practice, what it means to put it into practice. But it's something that I felt is really important to start with. That children, like I have heard several times people saying, this child has no language. Now, this child has language, just doesn't have your language, but the child comes with knowledge, comes with language, comes with a method that they've developed since they were a baby to make sense of the world around them. So we need to give children the time to immerse themselves into the new environment and not to eliminate what they know but to actually nurture what they know. So in the next video, we'll talk about how we can nurture and enhance and really exploit this richness of languages and cultures that we have in the setting. Thank you.